Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host John, and in the following 3 episodes we're going to take a look at some of my favourite articles from the OSR compilation zine Knock by the Merry Mushmen. And in this episode we're going to be starting off by looking at issue 1 of the zine after a brief explanation of what Knock actually is. But first of all, cue the music. Okay, so the Knock zine was put on Kickstarter at the end of 2020. This is issue 1 I'm referring to, and it bills itself as a zine that gathers some of the most respected, most creative and possibly weirdest minds of the old school role-playing scene, and has compiled some of their best work to make a substantially thick magazine. They've basically stuffed the 212 A5 pages of this zine, and it's a beautiful full coloured zine with lots of different articles that have been sort of given a bit of a polish in the blogosphere of the OSR, and they feature numerous luminaries of the old school scene who have written these articles over time. Very broadly, the zine is broken down into a number of sections. There are general articles on gaming and various subjects throughout the hobby. There are a number of random tables in there for you to just take and use in your games. There are a number of additional classes for BX style games, additional monsters, and a smattering of very interesting maps that you can drop into your game or use as you see fit. And this is by and large a format that the Knock zine has stuck to in the following 2 issues. As of the time of recording, there are 3 issues of Knock that have been released. We'll look at the other 2 later, but for this episode we're going to focus on some of my favourite articles from issue 1, and I'm going to give you an overview of what's in there in general, but like I say, focusing in on those that particularly spoke to me. Obviously this is just my own opinion. I'll tell you straight up though, I'm a big fan of Knock issue 1. I love the sort of weird collection of a bric-a-brac related to OSR that's in there, and even now it's something I'll quite often dip into for just a good random read or to spark some ideas when I'm running or preparing my own games. So without further ado, let's crack open the cover, which has a sort of a weird alien / demon looking like horned face on it, and see what's inside issue 1. The first thing you'll notice about Knock issue 1 is that it has a book cover on it that you can take off like a slipcase, and when you look on the inside you can see that it actually has a dungeon called Zarataraz Manse. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's an adventure for 1st and 2nd level characters, usable with all manner of adventure games, and we get all the detailed descriptions of the locations, etc. And I believe, yeah, on the back of it we also get a little map. So even on just the dust cover itself there is a whole OSR adventure that you can use. And this idea of cramming in absolutely as much as they can per issue is something that continues in the Knock zine. It's one of the things I really love about it. You also get a sort of detachable little bookmark on a thin cardstock called the Anarchical Grimoire of Polyphonic Discharges. And it's basically a random table which details a tome by the arch-sorcerer Catastrophis the Unshackled, bound with sheets of marble. Once per day opening it reveals a new spell which they can memorise as if from their own spellbook. And the table allows you to determine what the spell is for the particular item for that day. And as I say, it's brilliant that even a little bookmark that's handily put in there also has some usable information on it. So, flipping through the articles, we have an article by Brooks Daly called What I Want in an OSR Game, and it talks about the very specific appeal that the author feels that the OSR has. They're saying that they already got other options for games that focus on narrative heavy character drama and stuff like that. The author believes that OSR games are at their best when treated as an intentional, focused experience, rather than just trying to throw everything in. And the author goes on to break this down on what they believe an OSR game to be. Now, the whole idea of what is the OSR has been going around since time immemorial, so I don't think we're ever going to reach a sort of consensus on what that is. But I always find reading other people's ideas and theories about it interesting, you know, because occasionally you pick up some things you didn't know yourself. We then have an article by Gavin Norman of Necrotic Gnome, where he's making a comparison of Old and New D&D. And he gives a little bit of a sort of breakdown of his own experience, you know, being a long-time D&D player who has returned to playing a 30-years-old version of the game. He's going to write a bit about his experience, gives a bit of background on his prior experience of playing older versions of D&D, and sets what he believes to be the defining factor as a terseness and sparsity of older D&D rules, where the rules don't actually cover much and they rarely go into a great deal of depth. As he says himself in the article, it's not a game of rules, and the lack of specific rules and reliance on the DM to make improvised rulings brings home an extremely important feature of old school RPGs, the atmosphere of the game being more immersive and mysterious if the players are thinking in terms of being their character, rather than in terms of looking at all the abilities that they've got on their character sheet. We get an article called Monster Design from the Classics, The Lich by Chris McDowell. And he's talking about a book called the Cocktail Codex, making the bold claim there are only 6 cocktails, with all recipes being at least tangentially linked to those root recipes. So he gives the example of a martini being defined by the relationship between spirit, gin, and aromatized wine. And he makes the point that in D&D, sort of like as an analogy to this, there are sort of core concepts for monsters that are present in a specific monster design, and by just tweaking those little concepts you can entirely change a monster. And he's using the example of the Lich to break that down. So basically he's saying that the core of the Lich is magical powers, so you could change that to psionics to get a mind flare. You could tighten down the magical ability to a single extraordinary ability, or we could keep things focused closer to arcane magic and focus on a particular school from the classics. And he gives some examples of how you can tweak that. We get an article about energy drain and some potential alternatives if you don't like the loss of XP. And in fact, we use this article in my Old School Essentials campaign, where it proffers the idea, written by Gabalux, that instead of draining levels and XP, you actually drain constitution or strength, depending on the undead, from the person who's been targeted. These ability scores return slowly at a rate of 1 per day, and a character drained to 0 in a score is lost and becomes an undead of the given type. So effectively in this case you're trading in the grind of having to get back those levels for making the undead more dangerous in the immediate term, because you can be a 20th level fighter with like 1,000,000 HP or whatever, but you're really probably only going to have a max of 18 constitution points. So if you're getting hit by a wight, as it says here, and every hit it's knocking off 1d6 constitution, you're soon going to rattle through what you have. So like I say, it removes the grind, but it makes them more dangerous in the short term. We have an article on wizard weaknesses, a D66 table there. We have a random table for determining starting gear for characters, which is quite interesting. We have another random article. Like I said, there's a lot of random tables peppered through this, so if you don't like random tables, a lot of this probably isn't going to be your bag, but I absolutely love them, so there we go. We have a table for determining what a retired adventurer you might come across at a local village could be. And this is handy, you know, for when you meet those old, like NPC, the grizzled sort of veteran and stuff like that. You can just roll a handful of dice and you can determine that, oh, they're almost past their prime. They've got a reputation for a local drunk, but they're pretty harmless. Their past is filled with adventure and wild romance. You can gain their services with a handful of silver. If taken on, beware that they will drink every drop of alcohol while you sleep if able, and stagger the whole day through. And that's just one set of options you could come up with. There's a lot of different stuff in there, which is all good. We get, by Arnold K., a dungeon checklist article of things you should sort of go through and tick off in order to create an interesting old school dungeon. So, for instance, he lists something to steal, something to be killed, something to kill you, different paths, someone to talk to, something to experiment with, so traps and sort of strange things, something the players probably won't find, so encouraging repeat journeys to dungeons and thorough examinations. And I think that's all really good stuff to bear in mind when you're creating a D&D dungeon. So, skipping ahead a few, we have an article called Hit Dice Are Meant to Be Rolled, where the author, Eric Newdon, is basically saying, what's the point of having a mechanic called hit dice if you don't get to roll the dice when you get hit? So, he's proffering the idea that hit dice can be used as a soak mechanic here. And the idea of this mechanic is every time you are hit, you must beat the damage with a roll of your hit dice. You get wounded if you fail the roll. Being wounded gives you penalties. A set of conditions would make for interesting situations. Think dazed, blinded, off balance, stuff like that. A wound also forces you to discard a hit die when you're hit, and you don't have hit dice left to roll, you're dead or die. So it's an interesting idea for an alternative for just ticking off the normal hit points. We then get an article of 20 fantasy inspired gunpowders, so like blessed powder, Greek powder, flower powder, which is not very powerful but very cheap, and you can bake bread with it. I think that's actually based on a real world thing. If you don't like guns in your D&D, as many people don't, that's of limited use, but again, I like them, I use them in my game, so that's quite handy. We get a few more articles with random tables. Then we have another article by Arnold K. saying rulings not rules is insufficient. And in it, the author is breaking down Matt Finch's quick primer for old school gaming, which a lot of people get referred to. And he's talking about how just simply saying rulings not rules isn't really a sufficient merit for the game system, and he's discussing why he thinks both the system and the gameplay equally contribute to enjoyment of OSR games. We get an article called My Goblins Are, where we get a random sort of table for determining chaotic goblins, and this is written by Fiona Maeve Geist, and it brings to mind for me the goblins out of the labyrinth. You know, they're all weird individualistic creatures, and that's pretty cool. We get an article breaking down the labours of Hercules in OSR formats, an article by Sean McCoy providing some random table for determining what monsters want in a game. We get a save versus death, you know, if you want to make your game a little bit less lethal. We're then going to scroll forward a few articles, since I can't go into all of them because there's so many in this 212-page zine. And I almost hesitate to call it a zine because there's so much in it. It really is more like a supplement. We have an article on the danger of skills and how it can potentially sort of prove detrimental to OSR-style games. We have a simple system for changing the thieving skills from D&D into a D6-based system. We've got an article by Emmy Allen which talks about duels and how you can potentially use one-on-one fights for a bit more drama, and you can add a little bit of extra crunch to them. We get a few articles with random tables in. We also have an article which I particularly like by Jack Shear called What Happened in 1266. And he's saying that some of the best game setting inspiration is a casual browse through Wikipedia. And he's absolutely right. If you type in any sort of past date and what happened in this year, which is a handy function of Wikipedia, you will find some weird stuff went on. And a lot of it can provide great inspiration for your games. So Jack Shear is breaking down what happened in 1266 in this article and providing some ideas as to how you could use it in your game. We have an article by James Holloway, which I quite like as a fan of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, when he's saying his aesthetic is pathetic and yours can be too. And he's talking about the whole pathetic aesthetic idea where everyone in the party is a scoundrel, a ruffian, a ne'er-do-well. It's got that sort of British, like downtrodden, dirty, grimy aesthetic, you know, that you see in sort of like but Blackadder's like a comedy version of that we see in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and it's something that I quite enjoy both playing and jamming in games. So it's nice to see someone breaking down how you can bring more of that into your D&D and some of the benefits of doing that. We have D20 magical helmets, an article about the scope of module design. Then we get a few articles talking about maps, in particular one by Nicholas Dessau talking about the Borderlands and talking about the lack of name in the famous module Keep on the Borderlands, and explaining why the author chooses not to treat it simply as the lack of names being because it's a generic module, but as actually being part of the culture of the setting and the sort of time period, which is quite an interesting take on it. We get some more random tables and maps before we go on to a number of classes that have been provided for BX. We get the Living Harness, which is sort of like a Warforged style class. We get the Ne'er-do-well, is a lazy vagabond or an outcast. Probably work well with that pathetic aesthetic we described earlier. We also get the Naked Wanderer, a barely clothed person who delves into unholy crypts with only a blanket and a crowbar, where they sort of survive more by luck and fortune rather than their skills. We have a random sheep class from Gavin Norman, which is pretty much designed just as a sort of funny article to play on the idea of, like, you know, you send sheep or beasts of burden into the dungeon ahead of your party in order to like flush out any traps, but it's only a 5-level class. I suppose it could be used if you wanted to. We've got the Hamstero, which is like a humanoid hamster. Not really for me, but you know, whatever floats your boat. We've got the Swarmlord, a person who's learned a trick of summoning and controlling small creatures en masse, so a bit sort of like the sort of swarm druid of modern D&D. We get a D66 table of former occupations, what your character used to do before being an adventurer. Then we move on to Nock's Menagerie of Monstrosities, and we get a variety of interesting different creatures that can be bought into your game. And last of all, we have a few maps for you to use, and then we have reached the back cover. Now, I think that the problem, and it's not really a problem, it's more a feature of Nock, is that, as I say, it's a collection of bric-a-brac and such like from throughout the OSR blogosphere, which means that not everything's going to tickle your pickle or float your boat, and there's a few articles in here that don't really do a great deal for me, but because there's such a bewildering variety of stuff, it's really great just to dip into, and there's always going to be something random that takes your fancy in there, even if some bits leave you a bit cold. So I think it's well worth having, and as I say, I've sort of backed every issue of Nock on Kickstarter. If you're interested in getting basically a sort of an overview of some of the finest stuff curated from the OSR blogosphere, you really cannot go far wrong with Nock issue 1, in my opinion. If you're interested in getting hold of a copy, then it's available in PDF on DriveThruRPG for $20.55 US. Hard copies of some of the later issues are available from www.themerrymushmen.com, although at the time of recording this, the hard copy of issue 1 is out of stock and only PDFs are available. So I highly recommend you check that out, and I hope you'll listen to our next episode where I'm going to go through Nock issue 2 and talk about some of the stuff I like from there. So if you're interested in letting us know what you think of this episode, or chatting about anything to do with tabletop RPGs, or maybe giving us your own opinions on the Nock magazine, then you can get in touch a few different ways. You can leave us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe or Anchor, there'll be links in the description of this show, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. So until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.